Welcome to NewYorkBIO's virtual breakfast series, a digital program started in 2020, bringing you fireside chats with leaders from across the healthcare spectrum. This week's episode features Dr. Sara Nayeem, a partner at the venture firm New Enterprise Associates.
All right, welcome everyone. My name is Jennifer Hawks-Bland and I'm the CEO at NewYorkBIO. We're thrilled you've joined us this morning for another installment after last week's Thanksgiving break of our virtual breakfast series where we speak with leaders across the biotech sector and across the country. Thank you to VWR for being our sponsor. It's very important that we're continuing to bring content to you all, despite the fact that everyone is working from various locations around the country. I think we really can't even say home anymore. I think people have sort of scattered wherever they can find a safe place, right, to do their work. So with that, matter of housekeeping. So as we have our discussion with Sara today, you have two ways that you can ask questions that Derek and I can moderate for her. You have the chat feature as well as the Q&A feature. So if you'll put your questions in either one of those, we'll try our best to get to those. And without further ado, we're thrilled for Sara to join us today, and I'm going to kick it over to Derek to introduce her. Thanks.
All right. Well, thanks, Jennifer, and good morning. And I hope everybody had a really lovely Thanksgiving. Sara, it is fantastic to have you here today. Sara Nayeem, a partner with New Enterprise Associates, or as everyone knows them, NEA, a 42-year-old venture capital firm, one of the largest investors in the world, and certainly one of the leaders in healthcare investing. So good morning. The first thing we usually like to do is get a sense of, how our guests got to be where they are. So do you want to give us a little bit of background about how you came to NEA and really where you got where you are?
Yeah, absolutely. So first of all, thank you so much for having me. It's a great pleasure and honor to be chatting with you all today. So I've been at NEA for about 12 years. I came over from Merrill Lynch, where I was doing healthcare investment banking for about 2.5 years. Before that, was at Yale. Before that, where I did an MD MBA and did a couple of years of banking at Morgan Stanley before that. So been and was a bio undergrad before that. So kind of been between the business, medical, and finance worlds, and really enjoy the mix that venture capital offers. So it's been a fun ride.
Okay, excellent. And you've been involved, quite honestly, in some of the most interesting stuff in rare diseases, in terms of the innovation and other things that have been brought to patients. I don't know how many people in our audience are familiar with SciDAM, but SciDAM is probably the first accelerator dedicated towards rare disease investing and kind of changing the model about how we start companies and how we bring therapies forward in rare diseases.
Yeah, so yeah, I can talk a little bit about that model, but this was basically the brainchild of David Mott, who ran the NEA healthcare practice for a long time, just recently retired earlier this year. And we were seeing a lot of things in the rare disease space that were really interesting science and really passionate academics, usually heading these efforts. And sometimes in some of these diseases, there are only a handful of people in the world who really know the disease well. But what we were finding frequently was that there was something that was missing in the story that, needed to be solved to make it institutionally investable. Sometimes that was a few key experiments that hadn't been conducted, and there wasn't necessarily capital already in the burgeoning company or effort to do that. Or sometimes it was a lack of a management team, and just sometimes it's challenging to jump in and create all of that from scratch. So what we decided to do was to try something that we had done often. NEA's done in the medical device space many times, which is an accelerator model. In the device space, you can sit down, have a couple of engineers in a room, and they can sketch out a design, and it's actually not that expensive to put something into humans in a first in human in the device space. But of course, in biopharma, you need chemical matter, and you can't just sit there and create it out of scratch like you can a device.
It's so not a garage venture.
Yeah. So we hadn't seen it done, and we weren't sure that it would work. But we thought if you're going to do it anywhere in pharma, the rare disease space would be the place to do it because of some of these dynamics we had seen, and we'd also seen big pharma kind of having some missteps in the space, taking a big pharma approach to things, and sort of being in the space and being out of the space, and losing some credibility with patient groups. So we thought this is an area ripe for coming in and trying to take these projects and de-risk them in some way, whether that's preclinical, sometimes even taking over a clinical project, or looking at the market, trying to figure out if there's a market opportunity, IP that you can build around a repurposed asset. And then, we'd have a syndicate that could support those. So unlike in the medical device accelerators, where it's usually just NEA or maybe NEA and one other firm, in Sidon, we had a much bigger syndicate. So Sidon 1, it was ourselves, Bay City Capital, Lundbeck Fund, Pfizer Ventures, and Alexandria Real Estate. And in the second sort of iteration, Bay City is not in that one, but but Longitude came into that one. So and it's been a really interesting process, because I do think we brought in a lot of things. We spun out 3 companies, and I think Sidon 2 will probably spin out 1 to 3 more. But what's been interesting is to see all of the things that we haven't spun out, and I think it's been a really good experience to just see doing that killer experiment, which I think a lot of times people avoid doing in a way, because they sometimes don't want the answer, but that can mean people spend a lot of their time and a lot of effort and sometimes capital pushing forward on something that it could have been a fast fail, unfortunately, but that's just drug development. And if we don't approach it with that model, I think that the industry won't get more efficient, and we'll be missing out on the drug programs that really can be winners.
Yep. It's interesting. I was actually going to ask you about the stuff that you don't spin out, or the stuff that you actually try and it unfortunately doesn't work. And in rare diseases, that's exceptionally challenging, because I think there's almost a little bit more of, because there are so few patients and because the patients are so often children, there's almost more of a visceral emotional attachment to the patient. And you said something earlier that I think is important. You said that some of the larger pharma groups may have either lost touch or lost favor with some of the patient groups. And can you talk a little bit about how you see your role as an investor, and certainly the role as a startup company, in terms of, I'll use patient centricity, but actually being closer to the end patients in rare disease investing? Can you talk a little bit about how that's advantageous, and how you think about developing new therapies?
Yeah, so I think you really, in the rare disease space, particularly in indications where there's not already drugs in development and you're really breaking new ground, it's almost impossible to undertake those projects without having a really close relationship with the patient community, because starting from understanding the natural history of the disease, sometimes that requires running a natural history study, but at a minimum, you have to get in and speak with the patients. Oftentimes it's parents and families or other caregivers, and understand what are the real issues that they perceive, and what are the things that they would perceive as benefits that you can measure in a clinical program. You also have to understand what is the right patient that you would ultimately want to enroll in a trial. So in a disease like Duchenne muscular dystrophy, the boys are deteriorating over time, but they're kind of stable up until a certain age, and then they experience a decline. So we've certainly seen in that space, it can be challenging to identify that right patient population that's progressing somewhat, where you'll see some progression in the placebo group, but not so far gone that you can't rescue them, or at least stabilize them to some extent with your therapy. So that's often a challenge that a lot of elements of rare disease development it's iterative. You have to have a lot of perseverance, because you can start out thinking things are going to, you're going to develop a drug in this direction and with this clinical trial design, and then you end up realizing that won't work for sometimes reasons of just in the Tourette's space, for instance, where we had backed a company. Some of the measures that they use are, I'm not say a composite score. A couple of the things are just never going to change. They're just, they're not really amenable to being to changing with any kind of therapy, and other elements of those measures are much more amenable. So sometimes you sit back and say, well, what the field has already produced in terms of seeing how these patients are progressing, our drug will act on this and this part of that, and that's still a clinically meaningful benefit to the patients and the parents, but we somehow have to, figure out a way to find a new composite endpoint or validate some new measure that will allow us to get approval with the FDA. And so it can be a very long process of trying to understand what's meaningful, what can we impact. If we can only impact these elements of particular diseases, that's still meaningful. And many times in these diseases, particularly these very severe pediatric diseases, the parents are looking for any kind of improvement
Right.
they think is meaningful, but it can be a very challenging long slog for the drug development company. So it's, I think you have to have a lot of perseverance, and often a sort of maybe almost a logical belief in the mechanism of action that you're pursuing, because it can be very, very up and down. And then of course, when you're thinking about things like clinical trial design, particularly if it's a child and you have the parent needing to bring the child, you have to think about they're going to be taking time off work. They may, they may have to travel to sites that aren't close to their home. And so the full repertoire of, say, secondary endpoints that you might ideally like to capture, you won't be able to necessarily capture, because that would mean too long of a day. You need to think about how, if some patients, if they're getting tested in the morning, and something like DMD, where 6-minute walk test is really subject to just the patient's energy level, what they had for breakfast, how's their motivation. You don't want to have half the patients being tested in the morning and half in the afternoon, or the same patient sometimes in the morning, sometimes in the afternoon. It's even worse. So there are a lot of those elements that you need to take into account, and so we see it being very iterative. But I do think the FDA is has grown increasingly receptive to changing new things, working with companies, thinking about surrogate endpoints, composite endpoints, looking at the totality of the data. So really saying, the data that you've produced, do we think this is a clinically meaningful drug for this patient population? And then of course, the patient advocacy is also a big part of it, where the patient groups will themselves go and lobby the FDA and attend these advisory board meetings and make a case for why they think it's something that should come to patients.
Yeah,
we
that's
talk a
really
lot about, and I don't know if you've caught any of our other breakfasts, but we do spend a lot of time talking about patient engagement and how companies can better interact. How do you recommend that, particularly early stage companies working in the rare disease space, how do they find the right patient groups or patients to engage with as they start even thinking about development, even as they're approving their concept?
Well, I think you start with the KOLs, so the key opinion leaders and whoever are the academics that helped you, that generated whatever the technology is that you're working on, because they are sometimes, in certain spaces, they've seen a third of the whole patient community in a particular country, for instance. So they'll know the patient groups that are the most active, the most likely to be helpful, and that's a good place to start. And then from there, I think all the patient groups that you can get in touch with, it's worth connecting and having a conversation, seeing what their efforts are, how they can be helpful, and also how our companies, as they grow, we try to ensure that they're also being helpful to the patient community. So in the sickle cell space, we have a company called Amara. They've given out recently a number of community grants, and particularly post-COVID, the sort of the flavor of those grants changed, but all really important things. And also just being a voice for that patient community, where we've seen so many disparities in care, and sickle cell patients who are predominantly African American descent in this country, they're often considered to be drug seeking. They don't get pain medicines when they come to the ER as they need to. And some of these drug programs actually do show that when you relieve the patient's pain, they're using a lot less opioids. A company called Glycomimetic showed that in their phase 2 trial. So publicizing those results and making connecting with the physician community and making them aware of these biases that are really negative towards these patient communities. I think that's all part of the responsibility of the drug companies. I also think it's, in this age, we have so much on social media, And you have some patient communities where it's almost entirely social media, like the cystic fibrosis community obviously has been helped tremendously by, you know, the various Vertex drugs that have come out, but they're not really allowed to meet with each other because they can expose one another to their lung pathogens, and so they're actually told not to get together physically.
Yes.
And of course, right now nobody is, but these patient communities are really vibrant, and it's a delicate line. I've seen our companies trying to figure out how to interact with patients in these settings, and with patient groups, but without being kind of big brother or obtrusive. And so I think it's just, you know, really starting from those, you know, day one, those conversations, you know, interact, you know, and then saying, hey, would it make sense for us to, you know, post something on your patient community board? How can we interact in a way, you know, that's respectful? We also find one thing that patient groups and patients and families can struggle with a little bit is, what is the basic science behind all these different therapies? And when you have multiple therapies that are being brought into the clinic for a particular disease, one can seem, you know, a lot less onerous, like an oral therapy versus something that's, you know, an infusion or needs to be delivered intrathecally. But the parents and the patient groups also need to understand what's the science behind them and which are the most promising. So that's also something I think in the biopharma industry in general, we can struggle with being able to communicate the science in a way that's accessible to all of these different constituents. You know, from patient groups where actually many of them know a lot about the science, but they still may not know exactly how to interpret all of the data from your particular program, to just the general community, where we've seen, you know, up until the time of COVID, the biopharma industry was looked at less favorably than the tobacco industry. And these are people who are, you know, we're trying to produce drugs for, you know, to help people. And yet that's kind of the perception, which, you know, thankfully has improved as people have, you know, gotten a stronger sense of the importance of medical innovation with COVID. But still, I think we have a long way to go. So that, you know, that being able to communicate and, you know, starting from day one, and really, we encourage our companies to, you know, think about bringing a patient advocate on board as soon as possible, as soon as it can make sense within the structure and the budget, so that they have someone who's thinking about this, you know, kind of 24/7.
Especially when you have something like either a gene therapy or even something that's CRISPR based, which, you know, quite honestly, you know, just if you read it on paper, if you're not well in tune with all these things, can genuinely sound scary, right? You know, you even when you explain the mechanisms around the things, that people don't have a good grasp of what it means in terms of genomic medicine, you know, it can sound futuristic, and it can sound like you're basically rewriting their child's genetics, and that's probably pretty scary to a lot of people that aren't, you know, very well in touch with what the science is, how far the science has come.
Well, and you also have to realize that in any case, right, where you have a pediatric patient with some condition, like I had my oldest had a relatively rare condition, and so when he was little, and I immediately read everything, right? So all of a sudden you have all of these parents that are drinking from this fire hose of information, and not only the information they get, where they get it, how digestible it is, like all of that is really important, and also important for them to facilitate participation in a trial or otherwise, what other, you know, other treatment regimens.
Yeah, and we found that, you know, the way that people think about their own health is very different than the way people think about their kids' health.
Right.
Risks that they'll be willing to take for themselves, they're not willing to take for their kids. So I think, you know, the CRISPR-based therapies will probably, you know, for a while primarily be in adult, more severe populations, or with some of the hemoglobinopathies. And then the parents, so for instance, Amara is developing something that would be kind of a safer and you know, a more manageable alternative to hydroxyurea. Hydroxyurea has really good efficacy in the sickle cell population, but many parents, we found in our interviews, they're worried about the infertility aspects of hydroxyurea, even though, you know, perhaps it's overblown in their minds versus all of the data. But those perceptions mean that, you know, half of the patients roll off of it within a couple of years, and just many patients are getting a therapy that is, you know, ultimately could be helpful for them. And then you also have this dynamic in the sickle cell space, that adult hematologists don't want to deal with sickle cell patients. They don't have it's not a big part of their practice. Many patients, once they reach, 18 years old, kind of roll off their their pediatric hematologists, sort of range of ages. They actually get lost to the system. So that's a challenge within the healthcare system that a drug company can't address. It really requires a lot more communication with the physicians and advocacy directly to the healthcare system, and also just working with those adolescents. Of course, adolescence is also a time when many patients don't really want all of the constraints of healthcare system and trying to having to think about a chronic illness. So in many diseases they tend to disengage a little bit, but the hard part about sickle cell is there's really not a great landing spot for them when they come back, and that that early adulthood can be a time when they have a lot of damage done to all their various organs and brain, even with some of these micro strokes. So it's challenging. So as a drug development, we sometimes there's certain things that we can solve, and there's certain things that that we can't solve. And of course, that's also a problem too when you want to go out and commercialize these products for the adult population if they're not in the system. So it's something that I think we have to come at this from many different angles in many of these diseases.
Great. So you mentioned interaction between the companies and the patients on social media, and you're actually really active on social media as a person in the venture industry. And interestingly enough, rather than just announcing what your latest investment is, you actually spend a lot of time giving entrepreneurs advice about how to approach VCs, what kind of things VCs actually look for. And it's funny, but it's actually reasonably rare amongst people in the venture industry. There's always things that you can read, but actually there's not always that kind of perspective on the types of things that work in an early pitch type situation, or the types of things that venture people really want to see in a deck. And just to give everybody kind of a little bit of a denominator. So how many kind of first meetings do you typically take in about a year? Over the course of a year, how many first meetings with entrepreneurs or companies do you usually take?
Probably about one a day or every other day. So 200, 250, that kind of number.
Okay.
And I have a pretty low threshold to do a first meeting because if I think the science is interesting, if it I've heard of the entrepreneur, if I think the indication is interesting, if I think there's absolutely no way that I would invest in the company, then I don't think it makes sense to take their time. But often you can't get a great sense of that until you sit through the whole pitch. There are people who like to do a really brief call, like 30 minutes or less, with either the entrepreneur or maybe another investor who sent them the pitch deck and just hash out a few things, in that first call. So and that can work too, to kind of help you ascertain if you want to keep going with it. But generally, I do think actually just for the most part, getting on the phone and talking to entrepreneurs is important, because like you said, even if we don't invest, there is advice that we can provide and perspectives that we can provide. They may be flawed, but they're probably things that they're going to hear from other people, or things that other people will struggle with as well. So I do think that is, I have noticed that there's not a lot of that content out there in terms of just saying to people, hey, this is a mistake you can run into, or this is the way that we think about companies at this stage. And it's frustrating to see something that's really great science, but perhaps they just haven't done, like it's, the killer experiment. They haven't done, put the right control in, or they really pursued something in an indication that is just not going to be of interest to us at NEA, and probably to most, most venture capital firms. There are areas we call, graveyards that, people have tried many times to develop drugs in and failed repeatedly. So those may be easy places to get an animal model to run the experiment in, but you're still not going to get funding until you can do something that supports the drug program in an indication that's of interest. So, it's both from a selfish perspective of saying, wow, I would love to see companies have, their tied up in a bow a little bit more and have thought about some of these things before we see their pitch decks, but also it can be hard to get that type of input unless you know are able to show your early decks to, you know, a handful of VCs that you know, and just get feedback all along the way, which again, I think because biopharm, it's a lot of, you know, scientific founders, people who've grown up in the science field. There can be a little bit of you know, let me get the data all together and then I will show it to you, as opposed to trying to get feedback along the way. And also not necessarily knowing, you know, being primed to communicate things in a way that is going to make it really clear to anybody who picks up the pitch deck, because there can sometimes be this assumption that any investor will know the space well. They'll be able to just look at all of the, you know, the graphs and the experimental data and pick out what are the main, you know, points. And so that's something I always encourage companies to do is know there's, you know, investors get on the phone or the Zoom, they have their phones at, you know, there's a lot of things going on in the background. There are many things they're thinking about, you know, you know, they have a whole ton of things that they need to, you know, push forward in diligence. So what's going to really bring your company to make them think, okay, I want to do another call or go under CDA. You have to break through all that noise and, you know, get your points across in a very clear, accessible way. Don't just assume that you can just show a graph and people will know what the takeaway is, because maybe if they were fully focused on your presentation, they would, but they may be flipping through it, something they got by email, and just, you know, if it doesn't make an impression, then they just toss it aside. They, you know, they don't take the call, or they may be, you know, like I said, doing other things, thinking about other things at the same time. And so you have to, you know, just assume that you have to make everything crystal clear and walk through all of the different steps yourself.
And you mentioned a killer experiment before, and we had a question from somebody a little bit before, which says, you know, define what a killer experiment means to you, and also a little bit about, you know, maybe perhaps knowing what the killer experiment is, and really how to have that conversation with an investor, because there may be folks that are science-based that know what the killer experiment is but can't afford to run it, or they could probably think of stages of killer experiments, but, you know, how big do you go? So can you talk a little bit about that conversation that you have with folks, and really how's the best way to approach that conversation with someone like you?
Yeah, no, I think it's a good point. I think having, you know, getting input early is important. Like you said, it can sometimes be multiple steps in getting the data. I think what you don't want to do is spend a lot of your capital or grant money doing an experiment that doesn't, you know, push forward the thesis significantly. So if you can, you know, a big thing that we see is companies not including positive controls. So in particular, if the drug program is in a space where there are already competitors in the clinic or even out on the market, what makes me believe that your drug is going to, you know, be better than, or at least as good as these marketed products? So you don't need to have every single product in, but you should have some type of positive control that people can then say, okay, well, I can benchmark against this, you know, generic drug that's used in this space, or, you know, used to be used, something that you can actually get your hands on. Sometimes obviously you can't get your hands on things that aren't even, you know, that are just in the clinic, unless you can reproduce the structure or something like that. Sometimes people can go to those extents. But really that's, you know, that's one important element, is what are the controls. Another thing that sometimes comes up is what's the, you know, the more chronic therapy, or doing the experiment in an animal model that's more similar to how it would actually be used in humans. So if you have an animal model and you treat right when the mouse is born, and you show some great effect, and, you know, more the lifespan of the mice is longer, but in the clinical setting, you're actually, you know, not going to be able to treat those patients until they have significant symptoms, and that's when they tend to get diagnosed, and there's often a delay before they even get the diagnosis. And you also want to try to do an experiment in aged mice that, you know, at the point where they've started to develop symptoms. You can say, yes, we can rescue this, or at least slow down this phenotype if we go into mice that already have some symptomatology. Another thing is dose response curve, because just one single dose, especially if it's a really high dose, which oftentimes, if you're getting programs from academics, they're really trying to show something has a biological effect. They're not really trying to, fully elucidate what's going on. So that sometimes academics can be great collaborators, or you're getting the program from an academic institution. But I encourage companies to be really thoughtful about how they direct those labs to do experiments once they're, a company that's been formed and has this relationship, because sometimes academic labs will really push you. They don't include the controls, and they say, well, we've done controls in other, other experiments with other companies. We kind of know what they're like, and we'll be able to tell you if this has a good effect. Well, that's great, but that doesn't tell the investor that there's, we don't have access to all of that data, and we'd like to see it run with the control. We'd like to see it run with some, different doses, so we can say, mice are much more hardy than people, and so you're dosing something at incredibly high dose, especially a biologic. That's not necessarily going to mean that you're going to be able to find a therapeutic window in people. But I think you're right on the side of some of these experiments take a lot of capital, and so that's when you're going out for seed funding, being able to clearly define, these are the experiments we're going to run on the seed funding, and it's going to be, moving the program forward. And once we get through that, yes, now we're, the company will be at a place where we can do the A. But sometimes I do see companies, they've actually gone through their seed funding, or they've used, quite a bit of grant capital, and they've just been a little disorganized and not necessarily, honing in on what will make people believe that this, mechanism makes sense with this, this indication. That's something sometimes people don't know their drug's mechanism of action. If you can elucidate that, that's helpful. That's, that's something that many people want to invest in if the mechanism isn't clear. Or, some of these other elements of being able to say, yes, I think this has a pretty good shot of being something we can get to an IND. And again, it really requires a lot of, I think, collaboration and discussion all along the way. That's probably the part that's the hardest for some of these, early stage companies to get that advice.
So should the entrepreneurs be looking for seed stage investors that can help them with that process, rather than just investment of money that they then turn around and maybe, if they haven't done it before, they may not know what to look for.
Yes.
How to use that early stage capital.
Yes, no, absolutely. And I think the where you take capital from is also a big, a big part of the story, because at the seed stage, but even now we're seeing a lot of people interested in biopharma. We've had a huge influx of capital from many different sources. So you have your traditional, biopharma investors, private, and then many public investors now going earlier and earlier, sometimes all the way to company creation, like an RA Capital. We used to think of them as being really public investors, crossover investors, and now they even do, all the way to company creation. And they have many other sources of capital, people who may not be specialists in the space, but are excited by, seeing the XBI at its, all-time highs right now. So I think if you have your choice of capital, you really want to bring people in that can help you, like, as you said, think through what are the next steps. And in particular, people that have if you have people on your cap table that have the capital to invest in your next round, then they're going to advise you to run experiments that help them be convinced to put in the next capital. But if you just have friends and family, angel investors, or seed stage firms that aren't able to deploy capital to a Series A type fundraise, then they may be interested in telling you to do experiments that then the Series A funds are don't think are adequate, or they take you in a direction that doesn't bring you to the right place. So the other thing that we do see when people they have non-institutional investors in their A rounds, or even later, that you can sometimes get capital from sources that are non-institutional. There can be certain founder rights that are that are too onerous, that would also preclude institutional capital from coming in, or just other things about the way that the company is structured that make it challenging for institutional capital. So I'd say that you may be able to get some capital from sources that are not experienced in the space at even a higher valuation. It sometimes if the valuation is too high, that can also preclude the next round, and no one really wants a down round, but you can sort of spin your wheels for a long time trying to find someone who will invest at at least flat to your last valuation that wasn't maybe priced right. But so that sort of short term thinking of, okay, let's just take the capital where, you know, the highest valuation is placed on the company isn't necessarily going to set the company up for long-term success.
Yeah. And there's a lot of this that, you know, really the answer to a lot of it is make sure you talk to people that have done it before and have really the right kind of experience, because there's a level of romanticism in company creation where everyone wants to be excited for you. You're chasing a big dream, you have something that looks like it works. Everybody is really excited for that. So a lot of the feedback that you get from people is that's great, and that they're really, you know, wishing you good luck with things. And a lot of people really have to search out the people that have done it before that will ask them harder questions, because, you know, the hard questions are coming in one form or another at some point. This is a long game, and at some point you're going to get to an investor set that needs to give you enough money to get to an IND, and, you know, at some point along those lines you're going to get the questions about your animal models, about your killer experiments, etc. So it really behooves people to either surround themselves or seek out people that have done it before, and really try and be thorough in thinking about every aspect of what they're doing and knowing
Yeah,
what they
and
don't know.
I mean, the great thing about the biopharm industry is there are people who've done very well, had very successful companies. Of course, it's you know, many companies fail if you have these big wins, but those people work really hard to get their companies to that stage, and oftentimes CEOs, CMOs, CBOs, like, you know, once they've had a successful exit, they either retire or they sometimes, you know, take a few years and consult or do other things and just advise companies. So there are a lot of people out there with significant experience, and sometimes they don't necessarily want to run a company anymore, but they are interested in being advisors to young companies. I think the fascinating thing about the biopharma industry is you have all of these really great scientists and you know, people with these great platforms and technologies, and they really have a passion for the science. But what sometimes differentiates the companies that end up getting funding and being able to prove those out in the clinic and those who don't is this whole other skill set, which is being able to network, being able to find the right people, the right advice, obviously eventually, you know, finding investors. So it's really a place to stretch yourself, and, you know, and to make sure that perhaps you're adding someone else onto your team that is really good at that, if that's something that, you know, the scientific founder is less facile at, or tends to find an annoying part of the job, and not invest enough time into it. That's really you know, that's where we see a lot of these companies kind of fall out, is because they just want to hunker down and run all these experiments, and then they've used up their capital and they haven't really gotten input along the way. So it can be a little bit of a, you know, a not necessarily what people's personalities are absolutely geared for in this space, you know, in terms of some of these early founders, but it's critical to, you know, to get to the capital to actually prove it out.
Yeah. Now, just to give everybody a little bit of perspective, so does NEA go all the way to the seed stage, or are you primarily kind of Series A and beyond?
Yeah, so about half our companies are seed or Series A when we first invest, and half are later stage. And we've done more seed in the past, you know, 2 years than in my entire, you know, first decade at NEA. So that's partly because of the dynamics of the field, where there has been really robust funding environments. By the time things get to us at the Series B, they're often, you know, well overpriced, very much overpriced, or you know, they're priced for perfection, you know, as we say. So if it's a platform, if you think it's definitely going to work, and, you know, it's going to have product like this many products, and all, you know, these partnerships are going to produce you know, products as well, then yes, you can justify the price, but on a risk adjusted basis, it may not be there. So if you know, we invest early, then we you know, can protect our ownership and into some of those more expensive rounds, and so that's been the way that we've kind of moved in the last couple years. But obviously we invest across the whole spectrum. We don't do much venture creation in NEA, sort of one-off here or there. People have done that, but there are firms, of course, that is a big part of their model, or their entire model, like a Flagship or a Third Rock, you know, an Atlas, where they're creating their own companies. And I think it's a really great opportunity for any of those entrepreneurs, scientific founders who are within those ecosystems. And if you are in, you know, in Cambridge, for instance, you know, you want to take full advantage of trying to get into those ecosystems. But it does mean a little less capital there, because many of these firms are creating their own companies for startups where, it's a management team or a couple of people who are starting the companies themselves. But there are still plenty of traditional investors that don't, focus on company creation. And, as I said, many, public investors coming earlier. I don't know how long this really robust environment will last. We've had a really robust IPO market since 2013, and many of us thought it would already have, gone away by now, and it's actually even stronger now post-COVID. But yeah, I think there's, just in terms of NEA, we do early stage, we do, mid, we do, late stage as well.
Mm-hmm.
Sara, we've had a question, and we can't ignore that we are New York Bio, right? Specifically about how New York companies would attract your attention. And we've long had the conversation around companies will often start here spinning out of our world-class academic medical centers and then get lured to California or up to Boston, Cambridge. And so our focus is obviously on allowing companies and creating space where they can grow within the state of New York. So what do you say about how New York companies can attract investment and your attention?
I think there are fewer venture firms in New York than, say, Boston and DC. There's not much. So we're, but that being said, it's a very short flight to, up to New York. And I don't think it's not like we're talking, about Boise, Idaho or something where it's really hard to get to. Right. Yeah. So I think, the biggest thing people would mention is, well, wow, there's going to be, the cost for real estate and lab space is going to be very expensive. Now, you don't need to be in Manhattan. Obviously there are places that are, less costly, and Cambridge has gotten very expensive as well. But that's kind of a minor point, in my view. I mean, given how much capital goes into clinical trials. So that's, that wouldn't be an impediment. I think New York is a place where we'd, love to, back companies, continue to, that whole area, New York, New Jersey, there are plenty of biopharma. So I don't think anyone should see that as an impediment. Like I said, there are some firms that kind of mainly invest in their backyard, but that's, that's a subset of, Boston firms that kind of almost everything they do is in Boston and the companies they create. But I don't think it's a real impediment overall, because that's a small subset of the overall capital that's available.
So when you look at early stage companies, and when you look at the ecosystem for, between startup and mid-stage biotech, I think one of the big things that's been a really large topic both for us and across the industry is the level of diversity throughout the industry, whether it's in management teams or whether it's on boards. And this is an area that you've spoken on previously. So can you talk a little bit about how you both look at the makeup of companies as you're thinking about investing in them, and also how you see your role as an investor for potentially promoting a more diverse industry?
Yeah. So I think, we at NEA, we track our investments in female founders and, founders that are people of color, that, underrepresented minorities. We're doing well on those, but, certainly always room to do better. And I think there in terms of being able to make sure that we're backing a diverse group of entrepreneurs, I think it's a lot of education that just needs to happen in terms of what are the implicit biases people bring to the table. We've done that type of training at NEA. Many firms have incorporated it, particularly post George Floyd, and sort of this broad recognition across the industry of many of the challenges and barriers that exist. But it still requires a really, intentional approach. So trying to make sure with every pitch that you think through the same types of things, that you're asking the same types of questions, that you're, not sort of falling into, well, that entrepreneur just didn't seem to have, like I just didn't get the right feel from that entrepreneur, or they don't have enough charisma or something like that. So these are sort of code words that people use. I don't think they're intentionally trying to disenfranchise anybody, but it's, those types of perspectives are often employed against women and people that are different in one way or the other from the investors. So really educating ourselves on that, and then once we're invested, trying to encourage our teams to have diversity among the team, set goals. Every humans do better against any goal once it starts to be measured. That's just human nature.
Right.
We start trying to improve against that. So really, setting those goals and also thinking through, one thing we encourage companies to do is to make sure there's a banding for how people are compensated throughout all the levels. Of course, you have all these surveys and things like that at the executive level, but below that, at every level, all the way down to the most junior, there needs to be a band of this is the way this person at this level will get compensated, and not base it on their prior company's compensation, which can perpetuate some of these inequities. And then also on, we have nominating committees on, the new board members are generally nominated and chosen by the board. And so on all of our companies, we try to be really thoughtful about when we're bringing in someone else into the board, can we diversify the board? What does the diversity of the board look like? That obviously impacts, how the board thinks. There are these advantages to having diverse viewpoints. And then in terms of interaction with the board, I think companies can really help their employees by making sure it's not just always the C-level people talking at the board meetings. So really rotate different people at, sort of the VP level through, have them present part of the board deck to the board, because that gives them a chance for those people the board members, investors, to know their names, to see the way they think, to hear their thoughts, ask questions, and then 5 years from now, many of those will be starting their own company or thinking about it, and that can also help them feel comfortable reaching out and saying, hey, would you look at my pitch deck or talk to me about this idea I had. I'm thinking about joining a new company and starting a new company. So really making sure that there's interaction with the board and the investors, not just at the C-suite, but as far down as one can reasonably do it, and also some social events, some company receptions and things like that. Board dinners tend to be again very much the board and C-level folks, but some of these bigger events that are a little broader can often be more effective than just those really small board dinners.
With hopes that we
tends to demystify the process.
Social events.
Yeah, I know. Someday we'll get back to seeing each other in person again.
Yeah. So just in general, do you feel like it's, so you've been at NEA for 12 years now. Do you feel like it's getting better? Are we making progress? And it sounds like at NEA you have very good processes for this, but industry wide, when you look across other venture firms within the industry and you look at the way the companies are getting started, do you feel it's getting better?
I think it's been gradually getting better. More people have access to the industry. I think things like Twitter have been equalizers, access to advice and insights. But I think it will accelerate with this improved and increased attention to diversity and inclusion across the industry. I think I've seen firms that had very little efforts in the space become much more active and really thinking through it, both in terms of how they hire their own teams and how they think about funding entrepreneurs and giving up their time to provide advice. I think the one area where there's still a gap is that sort of early stage friends and family round. I mean, really many entrepreneurs need some type of funding to get to the point where they can even get a seed round. So that friends and family round, 100,000 to $1 million, that's raised amongst friends and family of the underrepresented minorities, those communities, they're not as wealthy, and so those entrepreneurs tend to not be able to draw from their friends and family for those rounds, and so they show up at the VC or seed funding door with having developed their story less far. So if there could be more vehicles for funding in that sort of early stage, I think that would really help And I think as an industry, we have to get out of this mindset of, VC is a very word of mouth, who industry. There's some elements of that that are just part of the business. But every time a VC goes to hire somebody, you can't just say, okay, well, let's first try within our network and see who we can turn up. And if we can't turn up someone that way, then we'll go do a broader search. I think really as an industry, we should be starting to publicize these searches from day one and not do that just in my network, which can sometimes be easier and you save a recruiting fee, but we really need to be publicizing these and not just have it be such a tight industry. If we only search within our network, then we're just going to get more people like the people who are already at the table.
Yeah, and it's a big challenge when you think about survivorship bias, right? Because there's a very, very big value premium placed on, well, this guy has done it before, and I used guy there intentionally, right? So this white man has done it before, so we're going to roll with him again, and he has brought his team with him. And it's a really big challenge, because in such a complicated industry, you have this dichotomy between wanting to see things change and also wanting to basically invest with people that are quote unquote proven commodities in one sense or another. So it's not the easiest problem, but there's a lot of, I think everybody recognizes there's work to do. And from what we've seen, at least, I think there's a lot of intention to change it. And the more people we see like you that are actually measuring themselves against goals and actually really putting things into practice, I think that's only going to make things better.
Yeah, and absolutely. And I will say that because we have had such a proliferation of companies and so many companies going public, and many of those public companies are drawing the people with the experience. And in the private biopharma space, most companies are headed by first-time CEOs. And even I saw an analysis of BioCentury that they just looked at a 6-month period, and the people they track in their newsletters that have moved around, and 57% of those that includes public and private, were first-time CEOs that came into CEO roles. And if you just spliced out the private, it would be even higher. So we are oftentimes backing first-time CEOs. I think what we need to have the right support for them, and oftentimes there are very active chairman or somebody who is an independent board member who's done it before, those types of relationships, and just a really active, involved board that says, you run with it, it's your company, but we're going to give you advice and help along the way to make sure that those first-time CEOs are successful. And again, I think we need to be making sure that they're a diverse group and not just white male first-time CEOs, that they're really a diverse group.
Yeah. Sara, we have I don't want to miss out on a few questions that we have, because
I see some pop up.
So one of the questions we have is, what are the therapeutic areas or disease targets that you would like to see more potential companies focus on?
So I think I really like the rare disease space. I really like the oncology, particularly precision oncology. I think those are spaces that get a lot of investment across the board, and there are definitely some underserved spaces. So women's health, for instance, there are huge unmet needs there, but there tends to not be as much activity there. I think the whole related to that, the whole fertility sector is ripe for a lot of innovation and a lot of new investment. And then, I do think the digital health space is an area where we're now that we've gone through COVID, we do see that you can have a lot of remote health, a lot of, remote visits with clinicians. Clinicians are finally on board. Patients are on board. How do we maximize that? How do we figure out what are the types of visits that are really, you can effectively do virtually versus things that you can't, and make that as efficient as possible. So I think, digital health is not a space I spend a lot of time on, but I've started to spend more time on it. I think that's, it's going to accelerate a lot in the next, next 12 months. And I think, that this CNS, so central nervous system, is an area where a lot of venture firms moved away from. And in the last, few years, there's been a lot of progress and a lot more venture backing. But it's still a challenge to, have models that make sense. I see a lot of exciting new innovations that are, going beyond just an behavioral animal model, looking at different biomarkers, imaging, different ways to get insight in early on, looking at, brain impulses and EKG-based things. So I think continuing to see progress in CNS, both neurodegenerative, we really need, a lot more focus on developmental disorders that goes along oftentimes with the rare disease space. So yeah, it's a lot. That's a broad list. But of course, kind of the rare disease space, precision oncology, there's still a lot of unmet need. And, venture is really about matching up the unmet needs with where the science is progressing. And so a lot of the reason that we've seen so much investment in things like oncology and rare diseases is because there's really high unmet needs. And we've seen, we've had this proliferation of new genetic-based therapeutic modalities, better understanding of the basis of disease, being able to parse out different subsets of cancer. So, that intersection. So I think we can't just say there are areas where we'd like to see more drugs. We have to figure out how to advance the science in those indications in those areas. And, and then that's where you'll see funding come into them.
Yeah. Do you feel like some of the advances we've seen that have been driven by COVID, whether they are decentralized clinical trials or anything, you mentioned telehealth, do you feel like those things are now going to start to become the norm when we think about drug development, when we think about clinical trials?
Yeah, I think with COVID, it's our companies that were clinical stage, they did a lot of creative things, from saying, okay, well, we're going to amend this protocol to allow patients to come 5 weeks out for their primary endpoint instead of just 4. Now the FDA has to grapple with that data, but it's, they're able to capture more patients that way, or work with home health to come out to a house and get, a blood sample or urine sample as opposed to having the patient come in. Being more creative about certain sites are closed, certain sites are still open. Okay, we're going to, put some travel dollars in so that we can help patients get to a site that's still open. So there's a lot of creativity that I think has, people are better prepared now for running trials efficiently than when we're in the post-COVID era, and being creative and being nimble. And then also I think with COVID, there's certainly been a strong emphasis around making sure we get a diverse population in both the therapeutic trials and the vaccine trials. And that I think will also filter through to many other areas. I mean, it is true that some minority groups like African Americans, they're not, many of them don't want to participate in trials. They've had bad experiences historically with clinical trials. So it's not just about saying, okay, well, we're going to try to enroll more patients in this particular group. You have to have the right communication strategy. You have to, have the right things in place to actually attract that group into your trial. So I think there's also been a lot more creativity around how to do that effectively.
Yep.
Sarah, this has been amazing. Thank you so much for being our guest. We appreciate everyone. Yes, thank you.
Yeah.
All right, this
really
is fantastic. Sarah, thank you.
All right.
Thank you so much.
Have a great day.
Have a great day, everybody. Next week, we have Wayne Koff from the Human Vaccines Project. And also next week, we have our Emerging Biotech Company Showcase that we put on together with the New York Stock Exchange coming up next Wednesday. Thank you. Sarah, thank you once again. Have a fantastic day. Everybody, we'll see you soon.
Thank you for tuning in to NewYorkBIO's virtual breakfast series. Join us every Tuesday at 9 a.m. for more discussions with leaders from across the healthcare spectrum. For more information on NewYorkBIO, please visit us at www.newyorkbio.org.